Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating and honestly terrifying period of history. We're going to explore exactly how the unresolved tensions of failing massive empires sparked a deadly chain reaction of global devastation throughout the early to mid-20th century. It's literally like a giant line of dominoes. When one colossal historical structure wobbles and falls, it doesn't just fall in a vacuum, right? It crashes into everything around it. That is exactly what happened here, and we're going to trace that path step by step.
So here's our roadmap for tracing this sequence of events. First, empires fall, alliances rise. Then we hit the First Total War, followed by interwar instability and economies. After that, it's nationalism and another war, and finally, the reality of mass atrocities. All right, let's jump right in.
Part 1. Empires fall, alliances rise.
Picture the dawn of the 20th century. The global power structure, it's starting to crack. We're talking about historic, colossal, land-based states that had flourished for centuries. The Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Qing Empire. They were all struggling. Take Russia, for example, where immense internal challenges eventually exploded into the Russian Revolution. So because these massive states were suddenly floundering and getting really desperate, they started looking for any artificial way to shore up their global positions and hold on to their power. And their big solution? Well, it was an incredibly flawed web of military alliances spreading all across Europe. Now sure, in the very short term, this kind of worked. It created this tenuous sense of stability, but man, there was a deadly catch. Because these diplomatic treaties were so deeply interconnected, the moment a conflict sparked, it literally dragged everyone right into the fire. Countries were forced into World War I simply to hold up their end of these complex agreements. Their supposed safety net essentially turned into a giant, inescapable trap.
Moving on to Section 2, the First Total War.
Once those alliance traps were sprung, the world wasn't just dealing with typical battlefield skirmishes like in previous centuries. This introduced a brand new, terrifying scale of destruction known as total war. And it meant exactly what it sounds like. It demanded absolute, complete dedication from the entire nation. Every factory, every farm, every ordinary citizen's daily life was suddenly redirected to sustain the war effort. It was a complete commitment of all available resources, both on the actual battlefield and back at home on the home front.
And because entire societies were pouring literally everything they had, all their resources, all their intellectual power, into the conflict, it hyper-accelerated the development of terrifying new military tech. Suddenly you have the deployment of gas weaponry and the very first introduction of airplanes into combat. This incredible industrial push to find better, faster ways to fight directly caused the unprecedented and frankly horrifying casualty levels of World War I. The very nature of warfare had permanently changed right before their eyes.
Which brings us to Part 3. Interwar instability and economies.
So, the guns finally fall silent. But the world doesn't just hit reset. Those dominoes, they just keep falling. Now the globe is grappling with intense post-war recovery, followed quickly by the severe economic volatility of the Great Depression. Governments quickly realized they couldn't just sit back anymore. They started taking highly active roles, desperately trying to force economic stability through incredibly aggressive domestic industrialization and rapid colonial expansion.
The crucial takeaway here is that multiple global powers tried to buy themselves economic relief by expanding their empires over other nations, and they entirely ignored the rights of the people actually living there. For instance, under the League of Nations, Germany's former colonies were simply parceled out to Great Britain and France, completely ignoring the will of the colonized people. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Japan is carving out what they call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, violently occupying neighboring nations and installing puppet governments. This blatant international land grab naturally sent global tensions skyrocketing all over again.
At the exact same time, inside their own borders, other nations were taking some pretty radical approaches to force stability. The Soviet Union, for example, pushed through a series of incredibly aggressive 5-year plans. Their whole goal was to rapidly industrialize their nation so they could compete with the more industrial and, frankly, less war-torn countries of the West. But to actually pull this off, they relied on a totally bizarre, practically impossible mathematical formula for success.
I mean, check out the propaganda from the state. This real Soviet poster from the era literally claims that 2 + 2 plus the enthusiasm of the workers equals 5. It's wild, right? It perfectly illustrates how the state expected sheer willpower and worker enthusiasm to bend the actual rules of reality just to hit their rapid industrialization goals. It really highlights the incredible, desperate lengths governments were willing to go to force economic progress.
All right, part 4, nationalism and another war.
So all these flawed patchwork solutions create this incredibly volatile mix of global tension, perfectly setting the stage for our domino effect to accelerate. Let's track it. Step 1, you've got unresolved tensions from the First World War. Step 2, the Great Depression swoops in and just decimates global wealth. And this incredibly miserable reality directly fuels Step 3, the rise of extreme ideas of nationalism. Disillusioned, struggling citizens were vulnerable, and fascist totalitarian regimes swooped right in, convincing the public that aggressive, authoritarian military agendas were the absolutely only way out, which, tragically, leads us straight to Step 4, World War II.
Because of this complete breakdown in the global political order, the world was plunged right back into a second total war. And just like the first time around, World War II demanded that governments utilize absolutely all of their available resources to wage war. It required even greater societal sacrifice and massive, unprecedented budgets completely dedicated to developing new, even more devastating military technologies. The cycle didn't just repeat itself, it had escalated.
And this brings us to our final section, Part 5, the reality of mass atrocities.
As these extreme authoritarian movements cemented their power, the domestic consequences became as horrific, maybe even more so, than the actual fighting on the battlefield. A major tactic of these regimes was the scapegoating of minorities. Populations were manipulated into turning against minority groups, falsely blaming them for the entirety of society's immense problems. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power precisely by tapping directly into this extreme nationalism. They falsely claimed that Jewish people were directly responsible for Germany's severe economic and political struggles.
And this hateful political platform of scapegoating eventually escalated into the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust. The German government systematically rounded up Jewish people, along with political dissidents, homosexuals, disabled persons, and anarchists, sending them to labor camps where they were systematically killed. Jewish people were literally forced to wear yellow stars on their clothing just to visually mark them from the rest of the population. The terrifying text on that historic badge translates to, "Whoever wears this sign is an enemy of our people." It is a stark, chilling reminder of exactly where unchecked nationalism and scapegoating lead a society.
So, as this explainer reveals, the events of the 20th century were all deeply, fatally connected. Ignoring the root causes of global instability, like failing states, flawed alliances, and widespread economic desperation, can trigger a massive chain reaction of conflict and unimaginable human suffering. Seeing how incredibly easily disillusioned societies can be led down the path of extreme nationalism and scapegoating leaves us with a pretty heavy, lasting thought. When our modern societies face immense economic and political instability today, what exact steps must we actively take to prevent these historical dominoes from falling all over again? Really think about that as you review the history we've covered today. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.